The letter was waiting on my kitchen counter when I walked in, thick cream paper with a gold embossed seal that looked completely out of place among unpaid utility bills and grocery flyers. I almost ignored it. Almost. The return address carried my late uncle's law firm, and that stopped me cold. Uncle Raymond had passed just 2 weeks earlier. A quiet funeral, no drama, no speeches. Just a man everyone respected and no one truly understood. I tore the envelope open standing up, jacket still on, heart thudding harder with every line I read. That was the moment my life split cleanly in two. According to the documents, I hadn't just inherited some land like I assumed. I had inherited 2,300 acres. Not farmland in the middle of nowhere, not forest tucked away from civilization, but a massive stretch of property wrapping around an upscale, tightly packed HOA community that called itself Silver Pines Estates. My uncle hadn't just owned land adjacent to them. He owned the land they were using, their private road, their back access, their emergency route. Every inch of it sat squarely on my uncle's deed, and now mine. At first I laughed. Surely there was a mistake. HOAs didn't just accidentally build their entire infrastructure on land they didn't own. That kind of incompetence belonged in movies, not real life. But as I sat down and read further, the laughter faded. My uncle had been fighting this battle quietly for over a decade. Letters ignored. Surveys disputed. Threats masked as compliance notices. He'd chosen patience over confrontation, waiting them out, letting them dig their own hole deeper with every unauthorized expansion. And dig they did. Silver Pines Estates had grown bold over the years. They paved roads, installed lighting, ran utilities, even listed their private access road in marketing brochures that boasted exclusivity and convenience. None of it was theirs. And now, suddenly, it all belonged to me. I hadn't even finished my second cup of coffee when the first knock came. Firm, confident, entitled. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s wearing a pristine blazer, sunglasses pushed into highlighted hair, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. Behind her stood 2 men in polos with the HOA logo stitched proudly on the chest. "I'm here regarding unauthorized presence on HOA-managed land," she said without introduction. "You need to cease any interference immediately." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She sighed dramatically, like I was a child who hadn't done homework. "We know the property changed hands. Happens all the time. But the access road behind your inheritance is HOA-controlled. You are not permitted to restrict, alter, or interfere with it in any way." There it was. Not a question. A command. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me slowly, documents still clutched in my hand. "You might want to check your maps again," I said calmly. "That road doesn't belong to the HOA. Her smile tightened. "Sir, I am the HOA president. I know exactly what belongs to us." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just handed her a copy of the survey my uncle had commissioned 3 years earlier, complete with county stamps and signatures. She barely glanced at it before scoffing. "This will be handled by our attorneys," she snapped. "You'll hear from us. And until then, you're not to block that road. Do you understand?" She turned and walked away without waiting for an answer, heels clicking like punctuation at the end of a threat. I watched them go, a strange calm settling over me. They had no idea. No idea that every step they took down that road was trespassing. No idea that their so-called lifeline existed solely because my uncle had allowed it. And no idea that I wasn't him. Where he had waited, I would act. Because if there was one thing those documents made painfully clear, it was this. Their entire HOA sat at my mercy, and the only access road they had was about to become very, very expensive. By the second week after the inheritance paperwork cleared, the situation had shifted from awkward to openly hostile. Word had spread fast through the HOA that the land beneath their only access road now belonged to me. At first, they tried denial. Board members insisted there had to be a mistake, that the road was community infrastructure and therefore untouchable. I let them talk. I'd already paid a surveyor, and bright orange stakes now marked the boundaries with brutal clarity. The road, every inch of it, sat squarely on my deed. That's when the letters started. Certified envelopes arrived almost daily. Demands, warnings, thinly veiled threats. They accused me of extortion before I'd asked for a single dollar. They claimed implied easements, historical use, emergency necessity. One letter even cited moral obligation, as if that held any legal weight. I forwarded every piece straight to my attorney, who responded with calm, surgical replies. No easement recorded. No prescriptive rights. No grandfather clause. Their use had been illegal for decades. The HOA president, a woman named Marlene, decided emails weren't enough. She showed up at my gate unannounced with 2 board members and a county deputy in tow. They acted like they were doing me a favor by educating me. Marlene spoke loudly, slowly, like volume could rewrite property law. She warned me that cutting off access would be dangerous, irresponsible, and socially unacceptable. The deputy stood there awkwardly, hands resting on his belt, clearly unsure why he'd been called. I stayed calm. I handed the deputy a copy of my deed, the survey map, and the attorney's letter. He skimmed it, then looked at Marlene and shrugged. "This looks like a civil matter," he said. Her face tightened. The authority she expected didn't arrive, and I could see the panic starting to surface. That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Someone streamed it privately, and the recording found its way to me. They talked about me like I wasn't human, an obstacle, a threat, a problem to be handled. One board member suggested filing false complaints to pressure the county. Another floated the idea of continuing to use the road anyway, daring me to stop them. Marlene promised she had connections and that I'd fold once things got uncomfortable. They underestimated 2 things: patience and paperwork. Over the next month, they escalated. Anonymous reports claimed I was running an illegal business. Inspectors showed up and found nothing. Someone cut one of my boundary markers down. I replaced it with steel posts sunk in concrete. HOA members began driving faster, deliberately kicking up dust whenever they passed my property, like intimidation by inconvenience. I documented everything: dates, times, license plates. Then came the ultimatum. A lawyer's letter arrived stating that unless I granted a permanent easement within 10 days, the HOA would sue me for damages, emotional distress, and interference with community harmony. I laughed when I read that last part. My attorney didn't. He smiled. "Good," he said. "Now they're on record." Because while they were threatening lawsuits, I was preparing something far more final. I wasn't interested in negotiating from fear. I wanted resolution. And the law, for once, was entirely on my side. By the next morning, the tone had completely changed, but not in the way the HOA expected. Overnight, I had pulled every document tied to the land: plats dating back 50 years, access easements filed and expired, handshake agreements never recorded, and one crucial survey that showed the so-called community access road sat entirely on my inherited property. Not partially, not shared. Entirely mine. The HOA had been using it for decades without a valid easement, relying on intimidation and the assumption that no one would ever challenge them. That assumption died with my inheritance. At 9:07 a.m., my phone rang. HOA Karen's voice was no longer loud. It was sharp, clipped, and pretending to be professional. She claimed they had new information and wanted to clear up a misunderstanding. I let her talk. She said the road was critical infrastructure. She said selling or restricting it would be illegal. She said their attorney advised cooperation. I calmly told her my attorney advised the opposite, and that any further access without written permission would be considered trespassing, effective immediately. There was a pause. Then the threats started again. She warned me the HOA would fine every homeowner who supported me. She said the county would never approve changes. She said I'd be the villain of the community. I responded with one sentence that flipped everything. I already filed notice of revocation with the county clerk this morning. Silence. The kind where you can almost hear panic setting in on the other end of the line. By noon, trucks started lining up near the road. Homeowners. Contractors. A school bus that suddenly had nowhere to go. I didn't block anyone yet, I didn't need to. The legal notice alone was enough to freeze everything. People began asking questions the HOA board had avoided for years. Why was the road never recorded? Why were dues never used to secure access? Why did one family now control the only entrance to hundreds of homes? That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I attended, not as a resident, not as a guest, but as the landowner whose property they'd been exploiting. The room was packed. Karen sat at the front, visibly shaken, trying to maintain control as homeowners shouted over one another. Some were angry at me. Others were furious at her. A few finally understood the truth. The HOA had gambled their entire community on someone else's land. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I laid out facts. I explained how the easement expired years ago, how continued use without renewal didn't magically make it legal, how I now had every right to restrict, lease, or sell access as I saw fit. I made it clear I wasn't there to punish homeowners, but I wasn't going to be bullied into giving away valuable land either. That's when Karen made her fatal mistake. She accused me, in front of everyone, of plotting this inheritance and suggested fraud. She implied I had manipulated the will. I pulled out certified probate documents, stamped and signed, and placed them on the table. Then I mentioned something she didn't know, her emails. The ones threatening past landowners. The ones bragging about forcing compliance. The ones already forwarded to my attorney. The room went quiet. By the end of the meeting, the board was fractured. 2 members resigned on the spot. Karen stormed out, insisting this wasn't over.
But it was.
Not because I was powerful, but because the truth finally surfaced. Their entire HOA sat on land they never owned, never secured, and never respected. And now, the person who did own it wasn't afraid of them. That night, I stood at the edge of the road as the sun went down, knowing one thing for certain. The balance of power had shifted, and the real consequences were just beginning. By the time the emergency HOA meeting was called, the access road had already been surveyed, documented, and quietly listed with a commercial broker. That detail alone would later send half the board into near hysteria. But at that moment, they still believed this was a bluff, a scare tactic meant to extract concessions. I let them believe that. I walked into the clubhouse calm, polite, carrying a folder that weighed more than it looked, not from paper, but from consequences. Every chair was filled. Homeowners lined the walls. Karen sat at the center table, arms crossed, jaw tight, already rehearsing outrage. She opened the meeting with accusations, intimidation, abuse of inheritance, hostile intent toward the community. I let her finish. Then I stood, introduced myself as the legal owner of parcels A through H, and placed the recorded deeds on the table. The room went silent in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then fear. I explained, slowly and clearly, how the road they had used for 27 years ran entirely through my land, never properly easement, never legally transferred. I showed county maps, tax records, and HOA minutes proving they had knowingly ignored the issue for decades. Karen tried to interrupt. I reminded her that she'd already threatened litigation against me, and that everything I said was now part of a documented meeting. She sat back down. I then announced that the road was under contract, contingent on final title review, to a private buyer who intended to gate it permanently. No threats. No drama.
Just facts.
That's when the shouting began. Homeowners demanded to know how they would access their homes. I told them the truth. That was never my legal obligation. Their board failed them. Karen stood up, screaming that this would destroy property values, that no judge would allow it, that she'd call the county. I calmly reminded her that she already had, and the county confirmed my rights in writing. I passed copies around. One by one, faces drained of color. People realized this wasn't personal. It was structural. Years of arrogance had finally collided with ownership. Then came the bargaining. Offers of cash. Promises of retroactive agreements. Apologies that arrived far too late. Karen suggested an emergency vote to force an easement. I explained, gently, that eminent domain didn't apply to HOAs, and even if it did, the cost would exceed their entire reserve fund. That's when the board started turning on her. Questions flew about why this hadn't been addressed sooner. Why she dismissed prior warnings. Why she bullied previous landowners instead of negotiating. Karen tried to maintain control, but authority evaporates fast when consequences arrive. The meeting ended in chaos, with homeowners demanding her resignation and emergency legal counsel. Outside, under the parking lot lights, several residents approached me quietly. Not to threaten.
To apologize.
To ask what options they had. I told them the truth again. My issue was never with the families. It was with the HOA's entitlement. I explained that I was open to selling access, at market value, to individual owners or a restructured association, but not to the current board. Especially not to Karen. That message spread fast. By morning, petitions circulated. By evening, Karen was suspended pending investigation. By the end of the week, the buyer raised their offer. And I hadn't even closed yet. By the time the ink dried on the access road sale, the HOA finally understood what power really looked like. Not yelling at meetings. Not threatening letters. Not calling police on property they never owned. Real power was paperwork, history, and patience, and they had underestimated all three. The new owner of the road installed a locked, gated entrance within 48 hours, staffed by a private management company that followed the law to the letter. Emergency access remained protected, utilities were clearly permitted, but daily convenience?
Gone.
The HOA board's phones exploded with panic, yet none of those calls came to me anymore. They knew better. The first emergency meeting after the sale was chaos. Homeowners shouted at the board, demanding to know how they'd lost the road. The president tried to blame survey errors. The treasurer blamed old maps. But the truth surfaced quickly. The HOA had known for years the road wasn't theirs. They had simply hoped no one would ever challenge it. When residents realized the board had gambled their access on arrogance, resignations followed fast. One by one, board members stepped down, some leaving the neighborhood altogether, others suddenly very quiet. What surprised me most wasn't their anger, it was their silence toward me. No lawsuits. No police calls. No threats. Their attorney had finally explained something they couldn't argue with. Every step I took was legal, documented, and defensible. Any attempt to retaliate would only expose more of their past violations. The same HOA that once sent fines and warnings now avoided eye contact if they saw my truck on the county road. Within weeks, homeowners began approaching me individually. Not to threaten, but to ask for help. They wanted mediation. They wanted solutions. Some even apologized for believing the board's version of events. I listened, calmly, and explained the reality. I didn't owe the HOA anything, but I wasn't interested in punishing families for a board's mistakes. The road owner eventually offered limited-use easements at market rates, with clear terms and zero HOA control. The neighborhood had to restructure completely just to survive. The county took notice too. An audit was opened into how the HOA had claimed jurisdiction over land it never owned. Records were pulled. Old approvals questioned. Suddenly, the HOA's entire foundation looked unstable. What started as one inherited property uncovered years of overreach. The board's reign didn't end because I raised my voice. It ended because the truth finally caught up. Standing on my land one evening, watching the sun drop behind the hills, I felt something close to closure. I hadn't planned revenge. I hadn't planned to sell a road. I'd only planned to protect what was mine. The rest happened because arrogance met preparation, power met paperwork, and a system built on intimidation met someone who wasn't afraid to read the fine print. The HOA still exists technically, but it's smaller now, quieter, careful. They follow rules they once ignored, and they ask permission where they once demanded obedience. As for me, I kept most of the land, sold what made sense, and ensured that no one could ever claim it behind my back again. The lesson was simple, and it spread fast through the county. Never assume ownership you can't prove, and never threaten someone who knows the law better than you. Because sometimes, the quiet landowner isn't weak. He's just waiting for the truth to do the talking.